Pretty much every Halo fan must know of the Falcon, so of course I had to build one and do it justice in its block form. In this video, I'm going to go over why I built the Falcon, some of the build's features, compare it to a previous version, a brief overview of the design, and finally a comparison to Mega's other Falcons. So let's get into it. Considering that the majority of the game only takes place on one planet, Reach, the Falcon makes perfect sense for it to be included in this game. In all the previous forms of the Halo games, you mostly play with Marines who act as an expeditionary force, so naturally they would use Pelicans to go from space to in-atmosphere and back. But in Reach, you as Noble Team spend most of your time with the UNSC Army as opposed to the Navy, and they wouldn't need exo-atmospheric types of vehicles, as they would be primarily focused on ground defense on the planet as opposed to offense up in space. And you see this over the course of the game. They are smaller, they're less imposing, and they're much more easily used by Noble Team than a massive Pelican would be. I would say that the modern day equivalents of this kind of vehicle would probably be the UH-144 Black Hawk or the Huey or maybe even the Hind. These aircraft have the role of transporting relatively small squads, and whilst they can offer some form of air support, that isn't their primary role and they can be quite vulnerable to ground fire. I think that a lot of people would jump to the comparison with the Osprey, operated by the United States, as both of these vehicles do have a tilt rotor configuration, but it's worth noting that the Falcon's tilt rotors never actually tilt fully forwards, so it never actually flies like a fixed-wing aircraft. And as the Osprey has a capacity of 24 people, both the vehicles just take on very different operational roles. In-game, I like to think that the Falcon acts a lot like an aerial warthog. In the game's sandbox, it's just far more balanced than the Hornet ever was. The need to have to cooperate with your side gunners just means you can't dominate quite as much as you can with just a single occupancy Hornet. It's easy to control, it's fun to fly, and it has that retro sci-fi aesthetic that perfectly slots in with the rest of the UNSC vehicles. Once again, a perfect addition by Bungie. So enough of what it's like in game, let's have a look at the model. The model has pretty much all the features that you'd expect it to have. The rotors tilt forwards and backwards on both sides, and obviously the blades spin as well. On the underside, the model has two nicely formed rear fixed skids and a front skid that neatly folds into the body. The front cockpit canopy folds up and a figure is able to be placed in the cockpit. The front gun swivels and tilts and is removable for a different configuration. Moving to the bay of the aircraft, it has the capacity to fit 4 out of the 5 in-game figures. Unfortunately, the top handrail conflicts with the 5th person being seated in the rear middle. You could almost definitely put a figure there if you took the handrail off, but I personally really like that detail, so 4's fine for me. You can place the 2 gunners in their seats by first putting a peg adapter in, and then you can secure that to the top of the seat rest. Both the rear guns can fold back, but also fold out for firing. And finally, handling of the model. There are plenty of easily accessible sturdy points that you can manipulate the model from, such as the wings, the midsection, or the tail section. But there are a few fragile points, such as the front nose and the rear tail wings, although these are easily reattached. As always, this is not my first Falcon that I've built, so I take quite an iterative approach to design. So once I build something, I then come back and have a look at what I really like about the parts of the design, but I also then look at other parts that I really think that could be improved. So when looking at this version of the older design, I think you can really tell a few of the parts that I have liked and brought forward into this new model. One of these features are the landing skids. Mega's specialised brick isn't bad per se, but it is too blocky and that changes the look of the model. It's also designed to be used with a very typical bottom-up building approach, so having to factor that in would drastically change the look of the main bay area. The wings of the Falcon are also very much inspired by the older model. Although they've been completely redesigned, they both use the same snot approach to building. They also use the same approach when building the front angle into that wing. The rear tail plane of the Falcon is also very similar. It's just had an added angle adapter for it to be tilted down and forwards at the same time. Although it had some positives, there are many areas that have been drastically improved from this version. It was just built in a much more conventional 90-degree kind of block way than the new version is. And I think that this is most obvious when you compare both the noses and the troop bays of both of them. So if you look at the new one, you can see that the troop bay is much more proportioned to the rest of the Falcon than the old one was. If you actually look at it in game, this area takes up a massive proportion of the vehicle. But this poses a few problems. Having a proportionate bay reduces the amount of area that you can use to attach certain parts of the vehicle together. And when you're brick building, you generally want this area to be able to make it sturdy. The biggest two problems I had with this model were the bottom rear and the top front of the troop bay. You just had such little space to do anything with, so I actually just had to spend a while playing around with various connection techniques to be able to get the connection I wanted with the right amount of thickness. But there was one other problem that I had that also compounded with this one. The canopy piece that Mega makes is actually oversized, so I'm going to go over it in the next video, but I have set a specific scale to go for when building everything in what I call the ultimate scale series. When I compared the Mega canopy piece to this template, I found that it was actually too long. So to try and make it look more proportioned with the rest of the model, I ended up having to recess the cockpit a bit further back in order for it to look appropriate. But Reforger, you say? That doesn't sound so bad, does it? Well, remember my previous problem with having to try and connect the top bit of the bay? Well now, because the cockpit needs to be recessed, the attachment points for the cockpit have to be incorporated into that system as well. It was difficult, but after a fair bit of playing around with various different bricks, I think it turned out alright. Another interesting feature that the Falcon has is that, from what I can tell, the entire wing area all the way along has an ever so gentle slope, and building that entire section with that gentle slope does a lot to differentiate it from other brick built models of the Falcon, and just allows the entire model to look a lot more believable. It also securely attaches to the other parts of the model and is a pretty strong segment in itself, so you can easily lift it by the wings. Despite this, they're only properly secured by a small section at the back. This can be fairly easily removed, and once you do, you can just lift the whole wing off. From here, you can see the attachment point of the upper engines. These are only held in place with clip pieces, which allow you to ever so slightly angle it to the side so it's closer to the in-game model. The rear black exhaust segments were a bit of a challenge, as I had a limited piece selection at the time, but they turned out alright. For the segment that's just behind the cockpit, I wasn't sure whether to go for a vertical or an angled design. In the game, it's slightly angled, but I don't think there are any pieces that have that slight of an angle to be able to replicate that properly. But in the end, I decided to go ahead and angle it, as it just adds that little bit more of interest into the model. For the front, these oblique angles are one of the harder aspects to portray in a block form. So ultimately, I ended up with the central section of the nose being a form of snot design, and I used ball joints with tiles to act as a form of nose cladding that could form this very gentle angle. It ends up looking really nice, but as there's so little space in the construction, it can only be reinforced with one level of plates, and this makes it very fragile to manipulate, so you can't pick up the model by the nose, unfortunately. The rear tail looks great and is very sturdy. It was a challenge to try and taper it whilst including some of the black detailing, but it all worked out well. As I said earlier, the main downside is that the tail wings attached ended up being a little fragile, but this isn't a massive deal as they are easy to reattach. One of my favourite improvements is the landing gear. I've managed to further improve upon it by adding a couple of these curved tubes, and the overall construction of it's ended up being really robust. I've never had a problem with it moving or falling apart, and they just look so sleek and non-brick-like. It's really nice. And the front landing skid looks great as well. You can pull it out ever so slightly and it stays stiff enough for it to hold the model, or you can slide it all the way out and it will lock in place a bit more, although this will look a bit less accurate to the game if you do that. And when you fold the skid back into the model for when it's flying, it also looks absolutely fantastic. The engines and rotors look fine. They're a very compact build, so there's not really a lot of detail that I can add into them. Instead of using a pin, which is what you would typically expect for this kind of mechanism, I've actually used a peg system. I've found that it's strong enough and it also keeps it quite stiff. I've got to say that the rotors that Mega have included have just always baffled me. They're just absolutely massive. If you look at the Falcon in-game, the rotors barely reach to the engine section, and that's exactly what I've done with mine. I've actually clipped them. I know that's kinda heresy, but it just looks so much better. If there was one area that I could improve the Falcon model easily, it would be just attaching some really nice, appropriately sized blades that had a nice, accurate curve to them. And finally, once again, this model has a detailed underside. It could definitely be better, as there's a fair amount of black showing through, when actually I wanted to clad it with grey tiles, but it definitely beats just the underside of plates. Despite how cool this vehicle is, there isn't that many Falcon sets to compare this to. In its essence, you've got two types of Falcon. So you've got their first ever design, which is the UNSC Falcon with landing pad, and then they essentially recolored this design for the Flood Hunters Falcon and the Blue Series Falcon. I remember getting the original green Falcon, and it was a really great set for the time, and I remember it being really coveted by the community up until about a year ago, till it was finally updated by the Falcon Sweep. This series of builds do have their flaws though, the main one being that the upper shaping was just flat and the troop bay was very, very compact. Secondly, and finally, we have the Falcon Sweep. And oh boy, this is an amazing set, and I've seen many say that they think that this is Mega's best set yet. But I have to say that after spending so long having a deep dive into the Falcon, I still think there's quite a few areas for improvement on this model. I do have to caveat that and say that this is so much better than the original, and the inclusion of all of Nobility makes this set just absolutely phenomenal. For me, I'm just thankful to get this colour again. It gives me the relatively easy ability to get modern, better and more versatile parts that they've made in recent years in this colour, which means that I should be able to update a few of my designs with these slightly nicer parts. Overall, I've got to say that I'm incredibly happy with how this mock turned out. It's such a nice model to look at, and I'm really glad that I managed to get in all the features I wanted whilst keeping the look so close to the in-game model. You might have been able to see, but there are a few parts in my other mocks that are grey rather than green, and that's mostly because before the Falcon Sweep I haven't been able to get these snot adapters in this colour. So now that I've been able to get a hold of more of these parts, I'm super excited to be able to finally finish off some of my models in the proper colour that they should be in. For this mock, I'd like to swap out a few parts, such as the wings have a few grey pieces on them, and I'd like to swap out a studded wing for a tiled wing. I definitely want to attempt to try and make the front a little bit stronger, and with a few of Mega's new pieces, I do want to have a look at remodelling the exhaust ports on the engines. So there's definitely a few areas I want to tweak, but I don't see myself changing the fundamental structure of this mock anytime soon. What are your thoughts? Are you happy with the just released Falcon Sweep? Have you been able to get one? Or would you be interested in another updated model from Mega? Speaking of which, I still have the Falcon Sweep built up, so I will be doing a comparison video soon. Before I do that though, my next video is going to be on what is Ultimate Scale Series. So I'm going to delve into the details of what scale the Ultimate Scale Series is set to and why, and go into a bunch of rules that I set myself when trying to build these models. So if you like this, or you like the sound of any upcoming videos, please like, comment, subscribe, as all that will really help me out. I'm Reforger, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.